May 1947. Fog blankets the hills of San Simeon, California. A frail old man steps out of a car on this lonely hilltop. This is the dark story of America's wildest party palace, Hearst Castle. For nearly 30 years, this was the ultimate playground for the rich and famous. Movie stars, politicians, and millionaires, all drinking by the pool and dancing under gold ceilings. They wandered past marble statues and zebras grazing on the lawn. But tonight, the music has gone silent. The man who built it all, newspaper king William Randolph Hearst, is almost out of money and out of time. The castle that once screamed power is now a quiet prison. It is a monument he can barely afford to maintain. And behind every wild party, there was a truth he tried to hide from the entire country. Why did America's most powerful media tycoon pour a fortune into a mountain palace he would eventually abandon? How did a boy who dreamed of castles turn that vision into stone walls that slowly crushed his own empire? This is not just a story about a beautiful mansion. It is a story about obsession, money, and the price of chasing a dream too far. What happens when your dream house starts to eat you alive? Unlike ordinary documentaries, you are about to discover this dark truth through Hearst's own crossed-out blueprints. These are the archival records left behind by the brilliant architect, Julia Morgan. The thick red lines on old yellowed paper will tell you a story that no party guest ever dared to whisper. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments which mansion you want to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The mansion still stands on that ridge where the mountains meet the Pacific. Tour guides now walk through hallways that once echoed with laughter. Visitors swim in pools that once hosted Hollywood's brightest stars. But the silence is heavy now. The parties are over. To understand how Hearst Castle became a monument, we must go back to the boy who dreamed it. We must look at the empire that paid for it, and the obsession that nearly destroyed everything. We start with the parties. In the early 1930s, San Simeon was the most famous private home in America. Weekend guests arrived by train, then wound their way up the mountain roads in a fleet of limousines. What they found at the top was almost unbelievable. A Spanish Renaissance palace, perched on a California hilltop, surrounded by the largest private zoo in the country. The Neptune pool stretched 104 feet, lined with Vermont marble. It was framed by a Roman temple facade transported stone by stone from Europe. The indoor Roman pool glowed blue and gold under a vaulted ceiling covered in hand-set mosaic tiles. Guest cottages the size of mansions dotted the hillside. Zebras grazed on carefully managed lawns. Hearst himself wandered the grounds in a rumpled sweater. He would point out new statues, new gardens, or the new wings constantly under construction. Friday night meant formal dinners in the assembly room. Movie stars sat next to senators. Directors pitched ideas to studio chiefs. Hearst presided from the center of a long refectory table. Marian Davies was at his side, keeping the conversation light and the guests at ease. After dinner came a movie screening in Hearst's private theater. This was followed by dancing, billiards, or moonlight walks through the gardens. The rules were strict, but simple. Dress formally for dinner. Lights out by midnight. No business talk at the table. And never, ever criticize Hearst or his newspapers in print. Most guests followed the rules. The castle was too beautiful, the access too valuable, and the experience too rare to risk losing. This was the American dream, made of stone and marble. It was proof that a boy from San Francisco could build something grander than European nobility, something more exclusive than any gentleman's club, something talked about even more than the White House itself. But by May 1947, The dream was collapsing. The floodlights were dark. The guest houses sat empty. Construction equipment rusted on unfinished terraces. Hearst himself was living in exile in Beverly Hills. His health was failing, and his fortune was drained after decades of spending faster than even a newspaper empire could earn. The castle he built to prove his power had become the symbol of his downfall. What happened between the wild parties and the silent halls? How does a man spend nearly 30 years building a palace only to lose it before he dies? The answer involves yellow journalism, broken marriages, loyal architects, a devoted mistress, and one simple truth. Some dreams are too big to finish and too expensive to abandon. This is the story of that dream. It's the story of how William Randolph Hearst turned a barren California hillside into the most extravagant party palace in American history. How he filled it with art looted from European estates and guests borrowed from Hollywood's A-list. How he used it as a stage for power, a refuge from scandal, and a monument to appetites that could never be satisfied. It is also the story of the people who built it for him, lived in it with him, and watched it slip away when the money finally ran out. The castle still stands, but the man who created it is gone. And the parties he threw are now just whispers in marble halls. But before Hearst could build his palace, he needed someone patient enough to turn his chaotic dreams into actual stone. Someone willing to listen to a man who changed his mind every week. Someone strong enough to say no when necessary, yet wise enough to know when to say yes. He found that person in a small office in San Francisco, where a woman was drawing blueprints that no one believed she could ever bring to life. By 1900, William Randolph Hearst owned newspapers in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. His empire was expanding rapidly. His fortune was secure, yet he still lacked a place that truly felt like home. He owned properties scattered across the country, apartments in New York, a San Francisco mansion inherited from his mother after her death in 1919. But none of them satisfied the thirst planted during his childhood trips to Europe. They were fine houses, but they weren't castles. Then he remembered the ranch. His father, George Hearst, had purchased 40,000 acres of ranch land along the California coast near San Simeon in 1865. The land was beautiful, but remote. Rolling hills covered in oaks overlooked the Pacific from high cliffs. George used it for cattle ranching and occasional camping trips with his son. Young Willie loved those trips. The freedom, the open sky, the wind blowing off the ocean. He loved the feeling that all this land, stretching in every direction, somehow belonged to his family. After his mother passed away, Hearst inherited the ranch. He was 56 years old, wealthy beyond most people's imagination, and finally ready to build something permanent. He needed an architect. Most wealthy men in 1919 would have hired a prestigious firm from New York or Boston. They would choose big names who designed in established styles for established families. Hearst made a different choice. He hired Julia Morgan, a 47-year-old architect working quietly out of an office in San Francisco. Morgan was unusual in every way that mattered. She was a woman in a profession almost entirely dominated by men. She was the first woman ever admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. There, she studied under the masters who trained the designers of Europe's greatest monuments. She returned to California and built a successful career designing homes, churches, and institutional buildings. Her work was known for its careful attention to structure, proportion, and craftsmanship. She was petite, soft-spoken, and absolutely precise. Where Hearst was expansive and impulsive, Morgan was methodical and practical. Where he dreamed in grand gestures, she thought in load-bearing walls, drainage systems, and seismic forces. Hearst had hired her years earlier for smaller projects, renovations and additions on his properties. He trusted her technical skill. More importantly, he trusted her to listen. Morgan didn't tell clients what they should want. She listened to what they desired and then found a way to build it. When you look back at Morgan's original drawings from 1919, the yellowed, age-worn papers preserved in the digital collection at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, you see something most documentaries never show you. You see hard evidence. On the first sketches of Casa Grande, Morgan's pencil lines depict a perfectly symmetrical building with two identical bell towers. It was neat, balanced, classical. But slashed across that drawing are thick, decisive strokes of red ink. It is Hearst's hurried handwriting. No, make the towers different heights, more interesting. Then, a week later, on another drawing, add third floor to west wing. Need more bedrooms. A month later, can we move the entire dining hall 15 feet north? These drawings aren't just art. They are forensic evidence. They prove we are looking at a man who never knew what he wanted until he saw it on paper, and then changed his mind. They are proof of an architect forced to redraw the same room 5, 6, 7 times. They prove this castle was never planned to be finished. It was planned to go on forever. In 1919, Hearst took Morgan to the hilltop at San Simeon and said something along the lines of, "I'm tired of going up there and camping in tents. I'm getting a little old. I want to build a little something." Little something. Morgan understood immediately that Hearst was not describing anything little. She had worked with him long enough to know his projects grew and mutated once they were underway. She knew he collected art and antiques by the shipload. She knew he wanted something grand enough to match his newspapers, his fortune, and his ego. What she couldn't have known was that this little something would consume the next 28 years of her life. They started with sketches. Hearst wanted a main house on the hilltop. He called it La Casa Grande, with 3 guest houses surrounding it. He wanted a Mediterranean style, something reminiscent of the Spanish missions from his childhood, but grander and more ornate. He wanted towers. He wanted terraces. He wanted pools. Morgan listened. She took notes. She walked the site, studying the slopes and feeling the wind. Then she went back to San Francisco and began to draw. A relationship emerged unlike any other architect-client partnership in American history. Hearst sent her constant letters filled with ideas, sketches, complaints, and demands. Morgan replied with drawings, cost estimates, and gentle corrections. When his ideas defied physics or engineering, he demanded the impossible. She made it possible. When he changed his mind, she adapted. Construction began in 1919. Neither of them knew that it would never truly end. But to understand why Hearst built a castle as if it were a never-ending game, you have to go back to Willie. He was the boy who grew up in other people's mansions. He was a child who was always being measured, but never felt good enough. He spent his life dreaming of a place that finally truly belonged to him. The obsession began very early in his life. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 in San Francisco. He was the son of George Hearst, a rugged mining millionaire. George had struck gold in Nevada and silver in South Dakota. His mother was Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a schoolteacher from Missouri. Phoebe had married into wealth, but she never forgot her humble roots. The family had money, but what they lacked, at least in the eyes of polite society, was refinement. George Hearst was a practical man. He understood ore veins and mining rights, but cared little for art or etiquette. Phoebe was different. She wanted culture. She wanted respect. She wanted her son to grow up as a gentleman. She didn't want a miner's brat with dirty hands and coarse language. So she filled their San Francisco mansion with rules. formal dress at dinner, classical music lessons, French tutors. She even imported art books from Europe. Young Willie grew up surrounded by wealth, but he lacked warmth. His father was often away at the mines or serving as a U.S. Senator in Washington. His mother was present but demanding. She constantly pushed him toward an ideal version of manhood he could never reach. The house felt like hers, not his. The rules were hers. Even the art on the walls, Renaissance paintings, Greek statues, Persian rugs, felt like her argument with the world. It was her way of proving the Hearsts belonged with the old money families of San Francisco. Those families looked down on mining fortunes as dirty and new. Willie learned early that he was always being measured. He was never quite good enough, never refined enough. The boy who had everything somehow felt like nothing truly belonged to him. Then came the trip that changed everything. In 1873, when Willie was 10, Phoebe took him on an 18-month tour of Europe. They visited museums in Paris, galleries in Florence, and castles along the Rhine. Phoebe studied art and architecture with the seriousness of a scholar. But Willie absorbed something else entirely. He saw power made manifest in stone. European nobility lived in castles. They filled those castles with treasures collected over centuries. Walking through those halls meant walking through proof of importance. It was proof of permanence. It proved your family was important enough to build something that would outlast you. Willie wanted that. Not the titles. America had no titles. But he wanted the physical evidence. The castles. The art. The weight of history pressing down on visitors. He wanted them to understand they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. The seed was planted. It would take decades to grow. But the boy who felt small in his mother's mansion was already dreaming of a palace he could finally call his own. Back in San Francisco, Willie struggled in school. He was brilliant, but unfocused. Charming, but difficult. He was always testing the boundaries his mother tried to enforce. She sent him east to Harvard. She hoped the school would polish his rough edges into the gentleman she imagined. It didn't work. Harvard expelled him after a notorious prank. He sent chamber pots engraved with the professors' names to the faculty. It was an expensive, elaborate joke, typical Hearst excess serving teenage rebellion. But the expulsion hardly mattered. By then, George Hearst had acquired a failing newspaper called the San Francisco Examiner. He mainly bought it to support his political ambitions. Willie convinced his father to let him run it. He was 23 years old, wealthy, reckless, and desperate to prove himself. He wanted to succeed in a way his mother would never approve of. As it turned out, the newspaper business was perfect for a boy who grew up feeling powerless in his own home. Newspapers allow you to tell people what to think. Newspapers let you attack your enemies in print, where they can't easily fight back. Newspapers let you build something loud, public, and undeniably yours. And if you run them right, newspapers make enough money to buy castles. The San Francisco Examiner was dying when Hearst took control in 1887. Circulation was low. Advertising was weak. Readers had better options. His father expected the paper to fail quietly, but Hearst had a different plan. He studied Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, the most successful paper in America at the time. He walked away with a simple, brutal lesson. Facts, by themselves, are boring. But stories sell. Pulitzer understood that readers didn't want dry reports on city council meetings. They craved drama. They wanted heroes and villains. They wanted to feel something when they opened the morning paper. Hearst took that lesson and pushed it further than anyone else. He hired the best writers he could find and paid them more than any competing paper. He bought better presses and used them to print massive illustrations on the front page. Drawings of murders, disasters and scandals. He ordered headlines to be printed in letters so large they could be read from across the street. And he told his reporters to chase stories that made readers angry, afraid, or amazed. Crime stories received attention far beyond their actual importance. Social scandals were investigated with the intensity of murder trials. Political corruption, real or exaggerated, was exposed with righteous fury on the front page. If a story wasn't dramatic enough, Hearst's editors knew how to sharpen it. A fire became a catastrophe. A disagreement became a blood feud. A minor accident was retold as a tragedy narrowly avoided. It worked. Circulation rose. Advertisers followed. Within a few years, the Examiner was profitable, then dominant. Hearst proved he could master a business his father never truly understood. But San Francisco was too small for the ambition growing inside him. In 1895, Hearst bought the New York Morning Journal and brought his formula east. New York was the biggest stage in American journalism, and Hearst arrived ready for war. His main rival was Pulitzer himself, now running the world from a golden tower in lower Manhattan. The two men began a circulation war that reshaped American media. Hearst outbid Pulitzer for star writers and cartoonists. He cut his price to a penny a copy, selling papers at a loss just to steal readers. He introduced color printing on Sundays and filled those pages with comics that became national obsessions. His papers screamed louder, printed bigger pictures, and told wilder stories. Journalists at the time called it yellow journalism, named after a popular comic character printed in yellow ink. The phrase came to mean sensational stories built on half-truths, emotional appeals, and shameless exaggeration. Hearst wore that label proudly. He didn't care about respect. He cared about winning. And then came Cuba. In 1896, Cuba was fighting for independence from Spain. Hearst saw an opportunity and seized it. His papers began running daily stories of Spanish atrocities, some real, many exaggerated, a few entirely fabricated. He sent artists to sketch brutal scenes of Spanish soldiers attacking Cuban civilians. He published letters allegedly written by suffering Cubans, pleading for America to intervene. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing 260 American sailors, Hearst's journal blamed Spain before any investigation could even begin. Headlines screamed accusations. Drawings showed Spanish saboteurs planting underwater mines. Editorials demanded war. Historians still debate what actually sank the Maine. The official investigation at the time blamed a mine. Modern analysis suggests an accidental coal fire ignited the ship's ammunition. But in 1898, the hidden truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story Hearst told so loudly that millions accepted it without question. America went to war with Spain. Hearst's circulation skyrocketed. And William Randolph Hearst learned the most dangerous lesson of his life. If you control the story, you control reality. If you shout loudly enough, facts begin to bend until they look like whatever you say they are. He had found his power. Now he needed a castle worthy of a king. The first buildings went up quickly. Morgan began with the 3 guest houses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol. Each was large enough to be a mansion in its own right. They surrounded the hilltop like sentinels, waiting for the main house to rise between them. Hearst couldn't wait for completion. By 1920, he was already bringing guests to the unfinished site, hosting them in tents and in the newly finished houses, while construction crews worked around them. He loved showing people the project in motion. He loved pointing at bare foundations and saying, "This will be the tower." But deep beneath the parties and the grand upper floors, there was something even the most privileged guests never saw. Rooms that no one was allowed to enter. tunnels leading to vaults filled with unopened crates. Morgan's blueprints showed them, but no one talked about them. The castle rose in layers, constantly shifting as Hearst's tastes evolved. He traveled through Europe frequently, purchasing entire rooms from dismantled palaces and ruined monasteries. Ancient Spanish ceilings, intricately carved Italian doorways, massive French fireplaces, and Gothic choir stalls. He shipped them all to California in enormous crates and demanded that Julia Morgan build the castle around them. If a ceiling did not fit the room she had designed, she redesigned the entire room. If a doorway required moving a load-bearing wall, she moved the wall. Hearst treated the entire project like the world's most expensive toy. He built the castle, much like a child builds with wooden blocks. He added pieces wherever they looked interesting, with no regard for perfect symmetry or architectural purity. Morgan, in a way that seemed almost miraculous, made it all work. She took his contradictory impulses and wove them into a cohesive whole, even when it defied every rule of classical design. But there was something even Morgan did not anticipate. Hearst wasn't just building a castle. He was building a massive storage facility. In Morgan's archival drawings from 1922, you can see a detail that most public tours never mention. A network of storage tunnels was built directly into the foundation of La Casa Grande. These were not wine cellars, nor were they bomb shelters. These were secret vaults for art. On the cross-section drawings, Morgan sketched rooms running parallel to the main hallways, hidden behind grand wood paneling. Access was disguised through secret doors in the library and the dining room. Each vault was 15 feet wide and 40 feet long, with soaring 12-foot ceilings. There was enough space for massive statues or monolithic architectural fragments. On a separate note, Hearst's own handwriting appeared. Need climate control. Temperature constant at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity at 50%. These pieces cannot be exposed until proper rooms are built for them. The problem was, those proper rooms were never finished. Hearst continued to buy, at a frantic pace, European antique shops, auction houses, noble families, desperate for cash after World War I. All sold their heritage to him. The wooden crates arrived every month. They were unloaded at his private pier. They were trucked up the mountain. Then they vanished into the dark tunnels. Some were opened and inspected. A few were used. Most were never opened at all. By 1930, shipping records revealed over 700 crates sitting idle in the vaults beneath the castle. Roman sculptures, Persian rugs, even ancient Egyptian sarcophagi. This was an entire heritage that Hearst purchased, with the intention of displaying, quote, someday. That day never came. The castle became a museum that was slowly swallowing itself. It was a place where possession was more important than actually looking at the beauty you owned. Morgan knew this. Her drawings prove it. But her job was to build what Hearst wanted, not to ask why. The main house, La Casa Grande, rose 4 stories with twin bell towers reaching toward the California sky. The facade was a strange blend of Spanish colonial detail, with Mediterranean proportions and sharp Gothic touches. Inside, the rooms flowed into one another without any obvious organizational logic. A Gothic library opened into a Spanish hallway. A Moorish sitting room led to a Renaissance bedroom. The assembly room, the heart of the house, stretched 100 feet long. It was lined with choir stalls from an Italian monastery and hung with priceless Flemish tapestries. It looked less like a living room and more like a throne room, masquerading as a country house interior. Then came the pools. The outdoor Neptune pool began as a simple rectangular design. Hearst rejected it. It was too simple. Morgan tried again with classical columns. It was better, but still not grand enough. She tried again and again. The Neptune pool underwent several complete reconstructions over 17 years before reaching its final form. 104 feet of Vermont marble surrounded turquoise water. It was framed by a Roman temple facade and surrounded by marble statues of Neptune and the nymphs. The indoor Roman pool was inspired by ancient baths Hearst had seen in Italy. Morgan covered every surface with millions of handset glass mosaic tiles. Blue, gold, orange, intricate geometric patterns. 8 marble statues of gods and heroes lined the walls. Light filtered through alabaster globe lamps, making the water glow from within like a dream world. The zoo grew alongside the architecture. Hearst imported animals from all over the world. Zebras, ostriches, kangaroos, elk, buffalo, even polar bears. They roamed semi-freely on the hillside in carefully fenced paddocks. Guests drove up the winding road, past zebras, grazing near native oaks. It looked as if this combination of African wildlife and California ranchland was the most natural thing in the world. This project never had a completion date. Hearst never intended to stop. The construction was the point. The accumulation was the point. He was not creating a home. He was creating a piece of forensic evidence. It was proof that William Randolph Hearst could have anything he wanted. Rules, budgets, architectural logic, all be damned. By 1925, San Simeon was a legend. Hollywood buzzed about it. Political circles whispered. An invitation to the Hill for the weekend became the most powerful ticket in California. The parties were about to begin. But a castle like this required a queen to rule over it. Hearst had found her long before the first stone was laid at San Simeon. Her name was Marian Davies. She was the woman who would turn these cold stone walls into something resembling a home. And she would be the one to watch it all fall apart when the spotlights finally faded. Within a year of their meeting, Hearst was bankrolling her film career. He used his vast network of newspapers to promote her movies. He tried to manufacture her stardom through raw money and relentless publicity. She actually had genuine talent. She possessed sharp comedic timing and a natural, easy screen presence. She could make even the weakest scripts feel alive. But the whispers followed her everywhere. People said Marian Davies was only famous because William Randolph Hearst said so. The whispers weren't entirely wrong. Hearst poured millions into her career. He founded Cosmopolitan Pictures specifically to produce her films. He pressured theater owners to show them. He ordered his critics to praise her, sometimes against their own better judgment. When talkies arrived and silent stars faded, Marian made the jump successfully. Hearst paid for the best directors, the finest writers, and the most lavish sets. He tried to buy her a permanent place in Hollywood's firmament. She never quite escaped the shadow of that support. The industry respected her work, but resented his constant interference. The public liked her films, but knew she was Hearst's mistress, not his wife. Millicent Hearst, the legal Mrs. Hearst, stayed in New York with the couple's 5 sons. They lived separate lives, but Millicent never agreed to a divorce. Marian would never wear a wedding ring. She would never be introduced as Mrs. Hearst. She would always be Miss Davies, the actress living with a married man. San Simeon became both her refuge and her cage. At the castle, Marian was the informal hostess. She greeted every guest and kept the conversation moving. She remembered everyone's name and their tiny preferences. She made Hollywood's biggest egos feel at home at Hearst's rigid, rule-filled table. She was genuinely kind. When actors struggled with alcohol, she quietly tried to steady them. When chorus girls needed work, she found them roles. When Hearst's mood grew dark and controlling, she cut the tension with a joke. She used mimicry and a type of emotional warmth that no amount of money could buy. She also drank. At first it was social. Then it became steady. As the years passed, it grew heavy. The strain of living under constant gossip took its toll. Playing the cheerful hostess every night while being socially shunned by polite society left its mark. The palace on the hill looked like paradise from the outside, but to her it sometimes felt like a beautiful prison with no exit. And yet she stayed. She stayed through the scandals and the rumors. She stayed through Hearst's failed political campaigns and public humiliations. She even stayed through his ultimate financial collapse. She stayed because, from everything her friends later said, she truly loved him. She didn't love the empire. She didn't love the headlines. She didn't love the power games his newspapers played. In fact, she disliked how cruel they could be. She loved the private William Randolph Hearst. She loved the man who could be silly, generous, and surprisingly fragile when the world wasn't watching. He built her a 14-room colonial mansion on the MGM lot in Los Angeles. It was another excessive gesture. A smaller palace plugged into the studio's power grid. He showered her with jewelry. He had scripts rewritten just to highlight her strengths. He consulted her on everything from editorial campaigns to which antique tapestry should hang in which room. And every weekend he could, he flew or drove with her to the hilltop. For a few days, they could pretend the rest of the world and its rules didn't exist. Marian made San Simeon feel warm. She took Hearst's monument to his own ego and softened it into something closer to a real home. The castle had its architect in Julia Morgan and its builder in William Randolph Hearst. But its heart, the reason guests wanted to return, was Marian Davies. Without her, the parties would have been pure display. With her, they almost felt like gatherings of friends. Almost. The routine almost never changed. On Friday afternoons, a private train car pulled out of Los Angeles, carrying 15 to 30 invited guests. By early evening, they arrived in San Luis Obispo, where Hearst's limousines waited. They began the slow climb up the winding 5-mile road to the castle. The trip took nearly an hour. Through the windows, guests watched the landscape shift from coastal scrub to oak-covered hills. Occasionally, they saw zebras or buffalo grazing in the golden light. The animals had no business being on a California ranch. Yet, they fit perfectly into Hearst's private world. Then the road curved one last time, and the castle appeared on the ridge. White towers glowed against the darkening sky. Floodlights washed over the pools and terraces. It looked like something from a dream, or from a movie set. That was exactly the point. Charlie Chaplin was a frequent guest. So were Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Cary Grant, Carole Lombard, and Joan Crawford. At one point or another, nearly every major star of Hollywood's golden age spent a weekend at San Simeon, alongside directors, producers, writers, and the occasional politician or business tycoon. The guest list was invitation only and brilliantly unpredictable. A silent film comedian might find himself seated next to a Supreme Court justice. A Broadway actress could end up talking by the pool with a British peer. The castle operated under rules that felt both relaxed and strangely rigid. Guests were assigned rooms, some in La Casa Grande, others in the cottages, each furnished with Renaissance antiques and museum-quality art. They were expected to dress formally for dinner. Cocktails began at 7:30 in the assembly room. Dinner followed at 9 o'clock, served at a long refectory table that could seat 40 people. Hearst sat in the center. Marian was by his side. The rest of the guests were scattered without any obvious order of rank or importance. The food was surprisingly simple. For all the opulence surrounding them, Hearst preferred straightforward dishes. Roasted chicken, simple vegetables, basic desserts. He disliked fancy French cuisine and saw no reason to serve it just for show. Bottles of ketchup and mustard sat openly on the table next to fine china and crystal. A small reminder that the man paying for everything still thought like a rancher's son. Dinner conversation was lively, but bound by invisible borders. People told stories, gossiped, and flirted. But no one talked business deals. No one started a political argument at the table. And absolutely no one criticized Hearst or his newspapers where he might hear them. San Simeon was presented as neutral ground, a place to escape studio pressure and professional rivalries, as long as everyone remembered who owned the hill. After dinner came the movies. Hearst's private theater, with about 50 seats, screened the latest Hollywood releases, often before they opened to the general public. Studio bosses sent him advance prints as a courtesy and as a form of insurance. A positive mention in his papers could make a film. A bad one could cripple it. Marian's films were always shown to warm applause, regardless of whether the picture was good, average, or worse. No one wanted to be the guest who didn't laugh. Then the night moved into smaller groups. Dancing in one of the sitting rooms, billiards, card games, or a slow walk through the gardens under the moonlight while the Pacific wind moved through the trees. It all stopped when Hearst's unofficial curfew took effect. Lights out at midnight. The public rooms went dark. The host retired. Guests could stay up in their rooms. But the official evening's performance was over. Saturdays had their own rhythm. Swimming in the Neptune or Roman pools, tennis on the courts, riding horses through the hills, lounging on the terraces in the sun while servants brought drinks and snacks. Some guests wandered through the endless rooms, stunned by the art collection, the tapestries, the statues, the ceilings taken from Europe and rebuilt on a hilltop. The atmosphere felt relaxed, but there was always an unspoken deal beneath it. You were here because Hearst allowed it. You enjoyed a level of luxury that almost no hotel on earth could match. And in return, you did not cross him. Not in print. Not in public. Not in front of his staff. Most guests loved the arrangement. It was a chance to network with the Hollywood elite in a setting that felt almost unreal. A chance to see art that usually lived behind velvet ropes. Here, scattered through hallways and guest bedrooms. A chance to swim in what many called the most beautiful pools in America, all while zebras grazed in the background like extras in some strange studio production. But a few guests found the experience unsettling. They noticed how closely Hearst watched everything. They understood how his papers could make or break a career with a few headlines. They felt, beneath the generous hospitality, that this paradise came with strings they could not see, but certainly felt. The castle was many things at once. A playground, a museum, a private studio lot, a stage set for its owner. What it was not, and never truly tried to be, was an ordinary home. It was a demonstration of power, dressed up as a weekend getaway. And that demonstration was about to get much darker. But while the Hollywood stars drank champagne by the pool and politicians negotiated in marble hallways, there was an entirely different world operating beneath the glittering surface. A world no guest was ever allowed to see. A world of 150 invisible hands that made the illusion of effortless luxury possible. Now, we go down the back stairs, down to the places where the floodlights never shine. While movie stars sipped cocktails by the Neptune pool, an entirely different group of people kept San Simeon alive. The staff, the workers, These were the people whose names never appeared in gossip columns, yet their labor made every glittering weekend possible. At its peak, San Simeon employed over 150 full-time staff members. Maids, chefs, gardeners, electricians, plumbers, chauffeurs, zookeepers, security guards, switchboard operators, secretaries. This workforce was large enough to run a hotel, a ranch, and a private resort all at once. They worked in around-the-clock shifts to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. They lived in dormitories and staff housing scattered across the property, tucked far away from the main house, far enough that guests would rarely notice them. They worked long hours for wages that were good by 1920s standards, but far from generous when measured against the sheer scale of Hearst's fortune. And they followed strict rules about how, when, and if they could ever interact with the guests, or with the Hearst family itself. The staff was expected to be invisible. A maid cleaning a guest room had to vanish if she heard footsteps in the hallway. Gardeners working near the terraces retreated and moved out of sight when Hearst or his guests stepped outside. Chauffeurs waited in hot cars for hours without complaint. Chefs prepared meals for dozens, but never tasted them in the dining room. The castle was staged to feel like a place maintained by magic. The rooms were always clean. The gardens were always perfect. The food always appeared on time. With no visible labor behind it, the class divide was absolute. Hearst treated his staff with distant politeness, but never as equals. He knew the name of the head gardener, but not the names of the dozens of men working under him. He recognized excellent service, but he showed little curiosity about the lives of those providing it. To him, they were essential components of the castle's operation. They were parts of a machine, no different from the plumbing or the electrical grid. Some staff members stayed for years, even decades. The work was steady. The setting was beautiful. Many had seen far worse employers in California. Others left quickly, exhausted by the isolation and the rigid hierarchy. San Simeon sat nearly 50 miles from the nearest major town. Staff had limited time off, and no easy way to leave the property. For those who came from farms or small communities, the ranch could begin to feel less like an opportunity and more like a self-chosen confinement. The chefs worked in industrial kitchens far below the grand dining hall. They prepared meals for 40 or more people at once, using recipes that Hearst personally approved. They served simple dishes on priceless china, cooking everyday food for people who could buy anything in the world. The irony was not lost on them. But beneath the maids and the chefs, there was another group. These were the people who didn't just clean or serve. They were the ones who actually built this castle with their bare hands. Master artisans from all over the world, imported for skills that no American possessed. Men who carved the ebony ceilings. Men who laid every individual mosaic tile. Men who sculpted the marble statues. And not one of them was ever invited to the party. While the maids swept rooms filled with Renaissance masterpieces, or scrubbed marble floors beneath ceilings imported from European palaces, they understood a grim reality. A month of their labor was worth no more than the single antique chair William Randolph Hearst sat upon. But there was another group of workers, men whom even the cooks and the maids held in high regard. These were the artisans. They were the men who didn't just maintain the castle. They created its beauty with their bare hands. Look up at the ebony ceiling in the library. This was the work of master woodworkers from Switzerland, imported specifically for skills that no American craftsman of the time could match. Every panel, every intricate floral detail, every perfect curve, shaped by hand over 3 years of continuous labor. They earned $4 a day, roughly $75 today when adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, the ceiling they created alone was valued at over $200,000 at the time. More than $3 million in today's money. These men worked from dawn until dusk in a makeshift workshop on the ridge, breathing wood dust all day, their backs aching from hunching over workbenches. They spoke little English. They slept in drab quarters far removed from the luxurious guest houses. And when the work was finished, they were paid and sent away. Not one of them was ever invited to the party. Next came the Italian artisans, the men who laid every individual tile of the Roman pool, over 1 million tiny glass mosaic tiles, each one placed entirely by hand. Shades of blue, gold, orange, woven into intricate geometric patterns. It cost them 4 years of their lives. They worked on high scaffolding in dim light, their bodies weary after thousands of hours with their arms raised high. They earned $3.50 a day, about $65 today. The pool was worth more than $400,000 upon completion, over $7 million in modern value. The stonemasons from Italy were the same. They were the ones who carved the statues of Neptune and the nymphs by the outdoor pool. They worked on blocks of marble weighing tons, using only a hammer and chisel to reveal the forms Hearst craved. Julia Morgan knew the name of every single one of them. She worked beside them, explained every drawing, adjusted every tiny detail, because she respected their craftsmanship. But Hearst never once asked what their names were. To him, they were just another component of the construction process. Highly skilled, but ultimately replaceable. When a phase was finished, the crew moved to the next project, or was shipped back to Europe. No celebrations, no public recognition, no invitations to see their finished work on display. Because of this, some artisans quietly carved their names into hidden corners where they knew no one would find them. A tiny signature in the grain of the wood. A mason's mark beneath a stone crevice. Silent proofs that say, "I was here. I created this." These are the people to whom the castle owes its true beauty, not the man who paid for it, not the guests who admired it, but the anonymous laborers who turned stone, wood, and glass into art. And perhaps most of us will never even know their names. But while these artisans poured their souls into creating eternal beauty, Hearst was pouring his money into something far more fleeting. Political power, influence, control. And just like the never-finished castle on the hill, his ambition had no stopping point. No budget, no limits, until the entire empire began to crack. Hearst was not satisfied with just running Hollywood's favorite weekend getaway. Controlling a social scene was fun, but what he truly wanted was political power. Power massive enough to match his money and his media. By the mid-1920s, his newspaper empire had become a behemoth. He owned 28 newspapers in 18 cities, plus magazines, newsreel companies, and a film studio. Roughly 1 in 4 Americans read a Hearst publication every single day. That meant a quarter of the country saw the world, at least in part, through the lens of William Randolph Hearst, whether they realized it or not. He used that power aggressively. His papers championed the causes he believed in. Sometimes he was progressive, sometimes conservative, but often he was contradictory. He supported labor unions one year and attacked them the next. He pushed for government ownership of railroads while fiercely defending private enterprise in other sectors. He opposed American involvement in European conflicts, but had no problem stirring up support for military action in Latin America when it suited him. The only constant was Hearst himself. His newspapers reflected his moods, his feuds, his changing whims, and his ambitions. And Hearst had very real political ambitions. He ran for mayor of New York in 1905 and lost by a razor-thin margin. He ran for governor of New York in 1906 and lost again. Each campaign cost him a fortune. Between races, he poured money into candidates who promised to support his ideas, then turned his papers against them with shocking ferocity when they disappointed him. Presidents sought his endorsement. Senators feared his attacks. Local politicians across the country checked the Hearst editorials before committing to controversial positions. You didn't need his support to survive, but it certainly helped. And you definitely did not want his papers to turn against you. San Simeon became more than a party palace. It became a political stage. Senators wound their way up the hilltop for quiet weekends, where upcoming bills could be discussed away from the cameras. Governors appeared when Hearst wanted to talk about state contracts, utility rates, or tax policy. Presidential hopefuls made pilgrimages to the castle, fully aware that favorable front-page coverage in the Hearst papers could propel an election. The castle provided something that politicians wanted almost as much as publicity: privacy. At San Simeon, far from rival journalists and party activists, deals could be floated, tested, and refined without leaving a paper trail. Hearst could make it clear what he wanted. Politicians could sense how far they could go without triggering hostile headlines. Everyone smiled for photos by the Neptune pool, knowing the real negotiations were happening on shaded terraces and in quiet sitting rooms after dinner. The line between journalism and political manipulation didn't just blur, it vanished. When Hearst opposed a policy, his papers framed it as a looming disaster. When he supported a candidate, that candidate suddenly enjoyed glowing front-page profiles, while the opponent was dragged through stories of petty scandal, old rumors, carefully chosen questions about their character. Truth became a flexible tool, arranged to serve the narrative Hearst chose. His editors understood their job was not to provide neutral facts. Their job was to help William Randolph Hearst win. The Hollywood guests watched all of this with mixed emotions. Some admired the raw power, the idea that a single man could rattle presidents by rattling a printing press. Others found it deeply unsettling. But everyone understood that crossing Hearst carried consequences. An actor who annoyed him might find toxic gossip about their private life splashed across his entertainment pages. A director who criticized his politics might find their films attacked by Hearst's critics. A producer who refused to cast Marian could suddenly struggle to get positive coverage for any of their other films. The hospitality of the castle came with invisible shackles. Most guests never felt those shackles, because they never pulled against them. They swam in the pools, praised Marian's films, avoided politics at the table, and went home with good memories and useful connections. The system ran smoothly because almost no one tested the limits. But Marian saw the darker reality. She watched senators and governors flatter Hearst to his face, then roll their eyes once he left the room. She saw studio chiefs laugh at his jokes in the assembly room, then complain bitterly about his interference when they returned to Los Angeles. She understood many guests didn't come because they loved Hearst. They came because they feared him or needed him, and she watched Hearst himself become more isolated, even as he surrounded himself with crowds. He had power. He had wealth. He had the most spectacular residence in America. But he had very few people around him who loved him for anything other than what he could provide. The castle was a throne, and thrones are lonely places. Even when they are full of guests, especially when they are full of guests. The first cracks appeared in 1929, but Hearst refused to see them. The stock market crashed in October. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. A depression settled over America, like a long, dark winter. Newspapers lost advertising as businesses slashed budgets. Circulation dropped as unemployed workers stopped buying daily papers. The revenue that had flowed steadily for decades slowed to a thin, unreliable trickle. Hearst kept spending. He bought more art. He added more rooms to San Simeon. He funded more of Marian's films. He kept his newspaper empire running at full strength. Even as competitors folded or merged to survive, he acted as if money were an endless river, as if his empire were too big to sink, as if economic disaster happened only to other people, not to William Randolph Hearst. His accountants told him otherwise. His sons begged him to cut costs. His business managers brought detailed reports, showing the gap between income and expenses widening every month. Hearst ignored them all. He had built his empire by thinking big and spending boldly. To him, cutting back didn't feel like sound business. It felt like surrender. The bills kept coming. Art dealers demanded payment for pieces purchased years earlier. Construction at San Simeon consumed millions of dollars annually. Payroll for thousands of employees arrived every month without fail. Property taxes were due on estates scattered across the country. Marian's film productions required constant infusions of cash. The zoo required expensive, ongoing care. By 1935, Hearst was in debt for about $125 million. Roughly $2 billion in today's money. His assets were massive, but almost entirely illiquid. He owned newspapers, real estate, vast art collections, worth hundreds of millions. But he couldn't turn them into cash fast enough to keep up with his debts. Finally, the banks stepped in. In 1937, a syndicate of creditors took control of Hearst's finances. They installed their own managers, placed strict limits on spending. They began selling off assets. Newspapers were closed or sold. Real estate holdings were liquidated. And most painfully for Hearst, they began selling his art. The treasures he had spent 4 decades collecting. Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, medieval tapestries. Each piece once chosen by him, now tagged with a price. Gimbel's department store in New York held a public sale of the Hearst collection. Thousands of items displayed across multiple floors. Wealthy buyers walked through, picking over pieces Hearst had once taken from European palaces and noble estates. The newspapers covered the sale as a humiliating spectacle, including some that once feared him. The man who had spent a lifetime buying objects to prove he would never lose anything was now selling them one by one to pay his creditors. Construction at San Simeon stopped completely. Workers were laid off. Plans for new wings and terraces were abandoned mid-project. Scaffolding stood around unfinished walls. The castle that had grown continuously for 18 years suddenly froze. Half-finished sections left, exposed to weather and time. Under the weight of it all, Hearst seemed to age overnight. He was 74 years old. His health was failing. Doctors warned him about a weak heart, but nothing was as painful as seeing his dream. The castle he had spent nearly 30 years building, now standing still, a half-finished monument to failed ambition. And there was one place Hearst would have to leave, a place he would never return to. He was 74 years old. His health was failing, and his life's work was being dismantled by bankers. These were men who treated him like a reckless teenager who had maxed out his credit line. The man who once bent public opinion with a single headline now had to ask for permission to spend his own money. Marian watched this shift with a growing sense of helplessness. The restless energy that had driven Hearst for decades was fading. He became irritable. He retreated into a private world. He grew obsessed with the tiny details of the castle's decor. It was as if he focused on the small things, because he could no longer control the larger forces tearing his empire apart. She tried to shield him from the bad news. She made jokes. She hosted guests. She did everything she could to keep San Simeon feeling alive. But the reality could not be hidden. The dream was collapsing. The parties at San Simeon became less frequent. Then they became rare. Eventually, they stopped altogether. An invitation to the Hill was no longer the most coveted ticket in California. The castle went silent. The staff was cut down to a skeleton crew. Entire wings of La Casa Grande were shuttered to save on heating and maintenance. Rooms that once echoed with laughter and music stood dark and locked. The tapestries and ceilings were now just assets on a banker's spreadsheet. By 1947, the doctors told Hearst he could no longer live at San Simeon. The castle was too remote. The mountain road was too long and winding for emergency care. If something happened to him up there, help would never arrive in time. He needed to be closer to Los Angeles. He needed hospitals and specialists. In May 1947, William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the very last time. He moved to a rented house in Beverly Hills. It was smaller, simpler, closer to the world he had once dominated, but now could only watch from the sidelines. Closer to the end. The castle remained on its hill, empty, silent. A monument in marble and concrete to dreams that grew too large. A testament to appetites that never learned how to stop. Proof that even the greatest empire has a breaking point. The Beverly Hills house felt like a prison compared to the castle. The rooms were smaller. The ceilings were lower. There were no towers, no terraces, no marble pools reaching out toward the Pacific. Just a comfortable mansion on a quiet street. A place where an old man could fade away without making too much noise. Hearst spent his final years shuffling through those modest rooms. He read newspapers he no longer truly controlled. He watched his empire move on without him. The banks stabilized his finances by selling enough assets to satisfy the creditors. But the price was everything that had made him William Randolph Hearst. His newspaper chain was smaller. His political influence was gone. His art collection was scattered. And San Simeon, the physical expression of his power and ego, sat empty on a distant hilltop he would never see again. Marian stayed with him. She didn't have to. By then, she was wealthy in her own right from her film earnings and independent investments. She could have gone back to Hollywood. She could have rebuilt her social life. She could have escaped the suffocating routine of watching a titan shrink. But she stayed. She stayed through his failing health, through his bitter moods, through his growing dependence on nurses, doctors, and medication. She stayed because, after 36 years, walking away felt like tearing out a piece of her own life. Hearst died on August 14, 1951. He was 88 years old. Marian was by his bedside. His wife, Millicent, still the legal Mrs. Hearst, despite decades of separation, flew in from New York for the funeral. His 5 sons came as well. Hollywood sent flowers and polished statements of respect. The newspapers he founded ran long obituaries trying to measure his legacy. Marian was not invited to the funeral. The Hearst family made that very clear. She had been his partner for over 3 decades. But she was never his wife. And now that he was gone, the family closed ranks. In the official story of the funeral, Marian Davies did not exist. 36 years vanished with one unspoken decision. She would be excluded. She accepted it without public complaint. She had never truly expected anything else. The castle had been her home, but never truly hers. The life she built with Hearst existed in a legal gray area that ended the moment his heart stopped beating. After his death, The Hearst family took control of everything, and they faced a brutal problem. The castle was incredibly expensive to maintain. Utilities for hundreds of rooms. Staff required to keep it from falling apart. Repairs to buildings damaged by years of harsh weather. It was a crushing burden. The family had no practical use for a 240-room Mediterranean palace on a remote California hilltop. They considered their options. Sell it privately to a billionaire. Tear it down and erase the memory. Or lock it up and let it slowly rot. But the castle was too famous to destroy. Too expensive and strange to sell easily. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation made a historic decision. They donated San Simeon to the state of California. The family kept the surrounding ranch land, but gave the castle, the guest houses, and the pools to the public. The condition was simple. It had to become a state historical monument, preserved, and open for guided tours. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem. The state would fund maintenance through admission fees. The Hearst name would be attached to something grander than a decaying corpse on a crumbling hill. And the public would finally be allowed inside the legendary castle. For nearly 40 years, they had only seen it from the highway. California accepted the gift. The plan began to turn the private palace into a public museum. Ropes and signs appeared where once only servants walked. The castle Hearst built to keep the world at a distance would now open its doors to anyone with a ticket. But hidden within those marble walls, there are still traces most visitors will never see. Names carved by the artisans who actually created this beauty. Silent evidence. A reminder that history isn't just about the man who pays. It's about the people who built it. The first public tours began in June 1958. Visitors wound their way up the same road that once carried the Hollywood elite. But they arrived by bus instead of limousine. They paid $2 for admission, roughly $20 in today's money. They followed guides through rooms that still held the faint scent of old money and faded ambition. The guides recited a polished, sanitized version of the story. They presented Hearst as a simple newspaper publisher, a devoted art collector. They pointed out Renaissance ceilings and medieval tapestries. They never mentioned how many newspapers he had shuttered. They never spoke of the crushing debts he piled up to buy those very objects. The tours showcased the Neptune pool and the assembly room, but without a word about the political deals made in those spaces. There was no mention of how Hearst once bent American public opinion from those very rooms on the hill. Marian Davies was barely a footnote in the official script. She appeared as a flickering detail, an actress who occasionally visited. There was nothing about her 3 decades as the castle's true hostess. Nothing about her quiet support for struggling actors. Nothing about her unwavering loyalty to a man who could never make her his wife. History was being edited in real time. The jagged edges were smoothed away. Tourists were given a simple, digestible narrative. The first visitors walked through the castle with mixed reactions. Some were overwhelmed by the opulence. Others found it gaudy, or even ridiculous. Many simply could not understand what they were looking at. Architectural styles collided at every turn. The scale felt oppressive. Mediterranean revival sat beside Gothic fragments and Renaissance furniture. It refused neat labels. Not a European palace. Not quite a museum. A strange hybrid. A rich man's dream made solid. Now open to the public, it felt almost like a theme park attraction. Former staff members occasionally joined the tours, blending into the crowd as paying guests. They walked through rooms they had once scrubbed, polished, repaired. They noticed details others never saw. A faint stain on marble they once tried to remove. A terrace where they worked through brutal heat. The doorway where Hearst had once stood barking orders. They rarely spoke up. Their memories were not part of the official script. The public story focused on the builder and his famous guests. It ignored the people who kept the machine running. The state of California began stabilizing the estate. Years of deferred maintenance had left deep scars. Roofs leaked. Pipes corroded. Gardens grew wild. Restoration moved slowly. Funded by rising admission fees as word spread of the castle's strange grandeur, journalists rediscovered San Simeon. Magazine articles labeled it Hearst's Folly, a monument to excess, a real-life Xanadu. The comparison to Citizen Kane was unavoidable. Orson Welles had loosely based his 1941 film on Hearst's life. The fictional Xanadu, a vast, empty palace where a lonely tycoon dies surrounded by objects instead of people. It seemed to predict San Simeon's fate with eerie precision. Hearst had hated Citizen Kane. He attacked it in his newspapers, pressured theaters not to show it, tried to bury it. He failed. The film became a classic. Now tourists walk through the real Hearst Castle, quietly comparing it to Welles' invention, wondering how much of the darker portrait was true. Over time, the meaning of the castle changed. It stopped symbolizing success. It became a warning, a lesson in what happens when wealth and ego have no limits, a reminder of what remains when the guests leave, when the parties stop. A beautiful, lonely place built to impress people who never truly cared about the man behind it. And yet, people kept coming. Thousands at first, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The private world Hearst, built to exclude the masses, became one of California's most visited tourist sites. School groups marched through its hallways. Families on road trips checked it off their lists. Architecture students took notes. Visitors from around the world came to see the hilltop where Hollywood royalty once played. The dream Hearst built to prove his importance now belongs to everyone. That irony alone might have angered him more than any bad headline. But the tours don't tell the whole story. They can't. The truth is too complex, too uncomfortable, too far from the polite narrative California prefers to attach to its famous landmark. Behind every stone at San Simeon stands the empire that paid for it. And that empire was built on something darker than art collecting and architectural ambition. There is a question no guide ever asks. Where did this art really come from? And who actually paid the price for it? Hearst's newspapers changed America, and not for the better. They pioneered a form of journalism that prioritized emotion over accuracy, sensationalism over truth, profit over the public interest. When Hearst needed circulation, his papers invented or prolonged scandals. When he wanted war, his headlines manufactured outrage. When he opposed a political candidate, his front pages went to work. They destroyed reputations using half-truths and carefully crafted lies. The Spanish-American War is the most famous example. But it was far from the only one. For decades, Hearst's papers stoked fear of immigrants. They specifically targeted Chinese and Japanese communities on the West Coast. They published overtly racist cartoons and inflammatory editorials. These helped justify discriminatory laws. They encouraged acts of violence. They sensationalized crime in ways that fueled public panic without making anyone safer. They turned complex political debates into simple morality plays. In their pages, Hearst's chosen side was always heroic. The opposition was always corrupt. This wasn't some unrelated side effect of San Simeon. This was the engine that made it possible. Every tower, every pool, every imported ceiling, all paid for by newspapers that made the country angrier, more fearful, more divided. The castle is breathtaking, but its foundation is rotten. Hearst never seemed to feel guilt about this. He believed his papers printed truths that the respectable media ignored. He saw himself as a champion of the common man, even as he lived in a palace that made European royalty look modest. The contradiction never seemed to trouble him. The castle also tells a larger American story. A story of the Gilded Age. And what followed. It represents a time when individuals could accumulate enormous fortunes with almost no regulation. Hearst inherited his starting capital from his father's mining operations. He multiplied it through a media empire with no real checks on its power. Power to mislead, to manipulate, to destroy. He built San Simeon when labor protections were thin, when environmental rules were non-existent, when the gap between the wealthy and the working class was vast and widening. The construction employed hundreds of workers. They slept in simple dormitories. Meanwhile, Hearst slept beneath carved Renaissance ceilings. Exotic animals for his zoo were taken from the wild, with no thought for conservation. Then there was the art. The collection was assembled by scavenging a Europe shattered by war and collapse. Hearst bought from noble families, selling off centuries of heritage. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. This wasn't traditional art collecting. It wasn't fair exchange. It was a systematic hunt for families in crisis. After World War I, Europe's economy collapsed. Aristocratic families who had lived in ancestral homes for generations could no longer pay taxes. They couldn't maintain their estates. They were forced to sell. Hearst's agents knew exactly where to go. They arrived with low offers, knowing desperation would do the rest. Ebony ceilings from Italian monasteries, stone fireplaces from French chateaux, Flemish tapestries from Spanish estates, Gothic choir stalls from English churches. Each piece represented a family forced to liquidate its history. Hearst didn't ask if it was right. He only asked if it could be shipped. In the 1920s and 1930s, hundreds of crates arrived at San Simeon every year. Some held Renaissance paintings worth millions. Others contained Roman columns or medieval doorways. Many were never opened. They sat in storage tunnels beneath the castle, purchased not because Hearst needed them, but because he could. Modern visitors see beauty. They see excess. What they often miss is the web of exploitation beneath it all. The workers who built and maintained it, the animals taken from the wild, the European families forced to sell their heritage, the newspaper readers manipulated into supporting wars and policies that served Hearst's power. The comparison to today is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Hearst's media model never disappeared. Emotion over truth, attention over information. It adapted, first to radio, then television, then cable news. Now it lives in social media feeds and algorithmic timelines. The principle remains unchanged. Grab attention by any means necessary. Monetize it. Use the power to advance private agendas. San Simeon stands as a monument to where that path leads. Not to wisdom, not to respect, but to a beautiful hollow shell. A cautionary tale. It's the story of confusing wealth with wisdom, power with purpose, publicity with legacy. Every visitor walking past the Neptune pool steps through a kind of crime scene. Not a crime of blood, a crime of values. A life spent accumulating instead of understanding, taking instead of giving, screaming instead of listening. The marble is still beautiful, but the stains run deep. But the story of the castle was never just about Hearst. Two women shaped San Simeon as deeply as the man whose name it carries. Their roles were minimized, blurred, quietly erased. Julia Morgan worked on San Simeon for 28 years. She made nearly 800 trips from her San Francisco office to that remote hilltop. She solved the technical problems Hearst created. She turned chaos into buildings that still stand. And yet, visitors are rarely told that she was the true genius behind the stone. Julia Morgan worked on San Simeon for 28 years. She made over 800 trips from her San Francisco office to that remote hilltop. She traveled by train and car over rugged, unpaved roads. She supervised construction crews. She solved the technical nightmares birthed by Hearst's chaotic imagination. She turned constantly shifting whims into real buildings. Structures designed to survive earthquakes, storms, and the passage of time. She was a genius in every sense of the word. Her technical skills were extraordinary. She understood materials, loads, stress, and structural limits better than almost any architect of her era. At the same time, she was an artist. She blended clashing architectural styles into something that felt strangely unified. Hearst demanded the impossible. Julia Morgan sat down with her pencils and vellum. She turned the impossible into reality. She did all of this while fighting battles Hearst never had to consider. As a woman in a male-dominated profession, she faced constant skepticism. Contractors, suppliers, and inspectors often assumed she didn't belong on a construction site. She proved them wrong time and time again. But the proving never stopped. Every project required her to demonstrate competence that male architects were granted by default. Morgan was paid well by the standards of the day, but never as lavishly as Hearst's dependence on her would suggest. He valued her work, but he exploited her patience and professionalism. He changed plans constantly, forcing her to redraw elevations, recalculate structures. He delayed payments when his cash grew tight. He demanded her attention on weekends and holidays. He expected detailed responses to late-night letters and telegrams. She accepted these conditions. San Simeon was the commission of a lifetime. A project of scale and complexity almost no other architect would ever experience. Then Hearst's finances collapsed. Construction stopped. Morgan was simply dismissed. No grand farewell. No public recognition. After nearly 3 decades of excellence, she returned to her San Francisco office. She quietly took on smaller projects. Eventually, she retired. When California opened San Simeon for tours, her name was barely spoken. Guides told visitors that Hearst built this. What they meant was that Morgan designed it. And Hearst paid for it. The architectural achievement was credited to the client, not the architect. Morgan never complained publicly. She preferred to let the building speak for her. But the injustice was real. The castle people admired was as much hers as his, yet history chose to remember only one name. Marian Davies suffered a different kind of erasure. She was written out of the castle's story almost entirely after Hearst's death. The Hearst family wanted the decades-long relationship to vanish. Tour guides said little to nothing about her. Photographs where she appeared too prominently were turned away, filed out of sight. The warmth and humor she brought to San Simeon disappeared from the official narrative. Yet Marian's legacy reached far beyond being Hearst's companion. After his death, she used her own considerable fortune, built not just from his support, but from savvy investments she made independently. She funded children's hospitals. She supported polio clinics. She quietly sent money to struggling actors and crew members she remembered from her film days. While Hearst spent decades projecting power, she spent her later years writing checks that actually changed lives. For most of her career, the joke in Hollywood was that she succeeded only because of Hearst's money. The truth was more complex. Yes, he funded her films, Yes, he used his papers to promote them. But she had genuine talent. Even skeptical critics acknowledged it. Sharp comedic timing, natural ease on screen, a reputation for kindness off camera. Her career may have relied on Hearst's backing, but her character did not. That belonged entirely to her. Both women gave years of their lives to Hearst's dream. Both were essential to what San Simeon became. One made the castle stand. The other made it feel alive. Both were brilliant in different ways. Both were reduced to footnotes. The spotlight remained on a man who could never have built anything there alone. History is slowly correcting this. Modern tours mention Morgan by name. They acknowledge her role. Biographies and documentaries treat Marian more empathetically. They highlight her loyalty, her charity, not just the scandal. Scholars now recognize that San Simeon is as much a monument to these two women as it is to Hearst himself. But for decades, the story was told differently. As if William Randolph Hearst single-handedly willed the castle into existence. Through money. Through determination. He didn't. He never could have. The castle stands where it stands. And as it stands. Because two extraordinary women made it possible. The sun rises over San Simeon much as it did 100 years ago. Golden light touches the white towers first, then spills down onto terraces and pools. The Pacific stretches endlessly in the distance, sparkling, indifferent. Tour groups arrive early. They walk through rooms where Charlie Chaplin laughed, where senators made quiet deals. They stand in the assembly room, where headlines were once born over coffee and gossip, and they leave with questions about the man who built it, about what his story really says, about what it is we leave behind when we are gone. Most visitors leave impressed by the sheer beauty and scale. Some leave unsettled by the excess. A few leave thinking deeply about the man who built it and what his story actually says. William Randolph Hearst wanted to be remembered. That much is clear. He wanted a monument that would outlive his body. He wanted to prove his importance. He wanted to show that a boy from San Francisco could build something grander than kings and nobility. In that narrow sense, he succeeded. The castle stands. His name is still on the signs. Hundreds of thousands of people visit every year and speak the name Hearst out loud. But what they remember is not what he intended. They remember the excess. They remember the loneliness implied by empty hallways built for crowds that no longer arrive. They remember the cautionary tale. A story of dreams that grew too large and appetites that never learned to stop. Many of them think of Citizen Kane before they think of Hearst himself. The castle teaches uncomfortable lessons about the American dream. It shows what happens when success is measured only by what you can accumulate. It highlights the gap between building something impressive and building something meaningful. It serves as a warning about how dangerous it is to confuse publicity with legacy, power with purpose, or possessions with happiness. Hearst spent decades collecting art, land, titles, political influence, and famous friends. He died wealthy, but diminished. He was separated from the hilltop that defined him. His empire was dismantled. His image was transformed into legend and gossip. The things he built outlasted him. But they tell a version of his story that he would never approve of. Yet there is something almost hopeful in what San Simeon has become. The palace that once pushed ordinary people away now invites them in. The estate built to show one man's superiority now treats everyone exactly the same. First come, first served. Follow the tour guide. Schoolchildren march through rooms designed for millionaires. Tourists from humble backgrounds stand beneath ceilings purchased from European palaces. The very people who might have been mocked in Hearst's newspapers now walk freely through his private world. a monument to inequality, was slowly, painstakingly transformed into a small victory for public access. And perhaps that is the real legacy. Not the building itself, but what happened to it after its builder lost control. Not the parties, but what came after the music stopped. Not Hearst's original dream, but what the rest of us chose to do with the ruins of that dream. Most of us will never build a castle. We will never run empires, host movie stars, or see our names in history textbooks. But we all build smaller worlds through the choices we make. We build through the work we do, through the relationships we nurture, through how we use whatever power we happen to have. We all leave stories behind, even if they aren't carved in marble or preserved by the state. The question San Simeon quietly asks is simple. What kind of story do you want to leave behind? A story of accumulation or contribution? Of power over others or service to others? A story that puts you at the center of every scene? Or a story that acknowledges the people who helped you build whatever you built? Hearst chose accumulation. He chose power. He chose himself. And he ended his life in a rented house, far from the castle that was supposed to prove his greatness. The castle remains on the hill. Beautiful, unnecessary. It is honest in ways its builder never intended. The ocean continues beyond it, vast, patient. It outlasts the headlines, the empires, the egos. The story we leave behind matters less than we like to believe. But how we treat people while we are writing that story matters much more than we realize. San Simeon stands as proof of both truths.